The busy Atlanta International Airport buzzed with activity on a warm Tuesday morning. People rushed in all directions, dragging their suitcases and checking their phones. Among them was James Morrison, dressed in an expensive gray suit that showed everyone he was important. James was 58 years old and worked as a senior executive at a big company. He always flew first class because he believed that's where successful people like him belonged. Today, he was heading to San Francisco for a business meeting. As he walked to his gate, he held his head high, barely noticing the other travelers around him. At Gate B7, the first-class passengers began boarding the plane. James walked down the jet bridge, thinking about the comfortable 5-hour flight ahead. He found his seat, 2A, a window seat in the first row of first class. He carefully placed his leather briefcase in the overhead bin and sat down, already feeling at home in the spacious leather seat. Other first-class passengers started filling in the cabin. James watched them with quiet approval. It all looked like they belonged there, wearing expensive clothes and carrying designer bags. The flight attendant, Maria Rodriguez, moved through the cabin with practiced ease, offering pre-flight drinks to the passengers. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Maria asked James with a friendly smile. "Yes, I'll have a glass of your best red wine," James replied, not bothering to look up from his phone. He was used to being served and expected nothing less. That's when Major Sarah Thompson appeared at the entrance of first class. She stood tall and proud in her crisp army uniform, with shining medals decorating her chest. Her black hair was pulled back neatly, following military regulations. At 34 years old, she had already achieved the rank of major through hard work and dedication. As Sarah checked her ticket and started walking toward the seat next to James, he looked up and froze. His eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. He watched as she double-checked her ticket, seat 2B. "Excuse me, miss," James called out to Maria, waving his hand to get her attention. His voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I think there's been a mistake. This person seems to think she has a seat in first class." Maria walked over quickly, trying to prevent any scene from developing. "Sir, there must be some confusion," James continued, pointing at Sarah. "She's trying to sit here. This is first class." He emphasized the last two words as if they held special meaning. Sarah stood calmly, holding her ticket. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes held years of experience dealing with such situations. She had served her country for over a decade, faced danger in war zones, and led troops into battle. This kind of prejudice was nothing new to her. Maria looked at Sarah's ticket and smiled warmly. "Everything is in order, sir. Major Thompson's seat is 2B, right next to you." James's face turned red. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But this is first class," he repeated, as if saying it again would change something. "Are you sure there hasn't been some mix-up in the booking system?" Other passengers began to notice what was happening. Some shook their heads in disapproval at James's behavior. A few pulled out their phones, ready to record if things got worse. "Sir," Maria said firmly but politely, "Major Thompson's ticket is for seat 2B in first class. Everything is correct." Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and professional. "It's all right," she said to Maria. "I'm used to this kind of thing." She placed her small military-issued backpack in the overhead bin and sat down next to James, who was now pressing himself against the window to avoid any contact. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James muttered something under his breath about standards these days and pulled out his phone, pretending to be busy with important emails. Sarah took out a book from her pocket, a worn copy of Leadership in Combat, and began reading, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. But her mind was already forming an idea, one that would teach James Morrison a lesson he would never forget. As the plane finished boarding, James Morrison's behavior only got worse. He kept pressing the call button, asking Maria to check if there were any other available seats in first class. Each time, she patiently explained that the flight was full and everyone needed to stay in their assigned seats. "This is completely unacceptable," James said loudly, making sure other passengers could hear him. "I paid good money for this seat, and I expect certain standards." He glanced at Sarah with disapproval, not even trying to hide his prejudice anymore. Sarah remained focused on her book, but her military training had taught her to be aware of everything around her. She noticed how other passengers were reacting to James's behavior. An elderly woman across the aisle kept shaking her head in disappointment. A young businessman 2 rows back was recording everything on his phone. Maria returned with another flight attendant, John, who was older and had seen this kind of situation before. "Sir," John said firmly, "if you continue to disturb the peace in the cabin, we'll need to have a serious discussion about your ability to fly with us today." James's face turned red again, but this time from anger. "Are you threatening me? Do you know who I am? I'm a platinum member with this airline." His voice got louder with each question. "Sir," John replied calmly, "your membership status doesn't give you the right to discriminate against other passengers. Major Thompson has every right to be here." A voice came from behind them. "She has more right than most of us." It was an older man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap. "That uniform represents everything we should respect." Sarah finally looked up from her book. Her eyes met James's, and she spoke in a clear, professional voice. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're uncomfortable, but I've spent the last 12 years serving our country, making sure people like you can fly safely and freely. I've earned my seat here, just like you've earned yours." The cabin went quiet. Everyone was watching now. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Well," he muttered, "I still think there should be some sort of screening process for first class." A businessman sitting behind them couldn't stay quiet anymore. "The only screening that needs to happen is for prejudiced behavior like yours, sir. It's 2025, for heaven's sake." The plane began to move away from the gate. Maria and John made their final checks, giving James a warning look. Sarah pulled out some papers from her briefcase and began reviewing them. They were medical evacuation reports, but James didn't know that yet. As the plane taxied to the runway, more passengers came forward to show their support for Sarah. A young girl, about 7 years old, woke up from business class with her mother's permission. She handed Sarah a drawing she had made of an American flag. "Thank you for protecting us," the little girl said shyly. Sarah's face lit up with a warm smile as she accepted the drawing. James watched this interaction from the corner of his eye. Something flickered across his face. Maybe doubt, maybe shame, but he quickly pushed it away and pulled out his laptop. The plane took off, climbing into the clear blue sky. The first-class cabin settled into an uncomfortable silence. Every time Sarah moved, even slightly, James would press himself further against the window. When she took out her water bottle, he acted as if she didn't exist. Sarah noticed all of this but remained professional. She had dealt with prejudice before, but something about this situation felt different. As she looked at the medical reports in her hands, she knew she had information that would completely change James Morrison's perspective. The flight attendants started their drink service. When they reached row 2, Maria made a point of serving Sarah first, with extra respect in her voice. "What would you like to drink, Major Thompson?" "Just water, please," Sarah replied politely. "I need to stay focused on these important documents." She emphasized the word important slightly, noticing how James' ear turned toward their conversation despite his attempts to ignore her. Little did James know that these documents would soon turn his world upside down and teach him a lesson about judgment that he would never forget. 2 hours into the flight, the tension in first class remained high. Sarah Thompson had spread her medical evacuation papers across her tray table, studying them carefully. Each page contained details about soldiers she had helped save, including one very special case that James Morrison knew nothing about. James kept trying to read Sarah's documents from the corner of his eye while pretending not to look at her. The military stamps and official seals on the papers made him curious, though he would never admit it. His face showed a mix of emotions: anger, curiosity, and something else that looked almost like worry. "More water, Major Thompson?" Maria asked, stopping by their row again. She had been checking on Sarah frequently, partly to show support and partly to keep an eye on James's behavior. "Yes, please," Sarah replied. As Maria poured the water, Sarah's hand accidentally brushed against one of the papers, sending it floating to the floor near James's feet. James stared at the paper but didn't move. Other passengers watched, waiting to see what he would do. After several uncomfortable seconds, the Vietnam veteran from earlier started to get up to help, but Sarah raised her hand politely to stop him. "It's okay, sir," she said to the veteran. "I'm sure Mr. Morrison will do the right thing." Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that made James squirm in his seat. Finally, James reached down and picked up the paper. As he did, his eyes caught a familiar name on the document. Morrison, Daniel J. His hand began to shake slightly, but he quickly handed the paper back to Sarah without looking at her. Sarah noticed his reaction. She had been waiting for this moment. She knew that James had seen his son's name, but she also knew he hadn't read the full details yet. The real impact was still to come. Taking out her notepad, Sarah began to write. Her pen moved smoothly across the paper as she composed a message that would change everything. James pretended to work on his laptop, but he kept glancing at her writing, wondering what she could be working on so intently. A light turbulence shook the plane, causing James to grab his armrest. To his surprise, he found his hand gripping the same armrest as Sarah's. He quickly pulled away as if burned, making Sarah shake her head slightly as she continued writing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the speaker, "we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." During the bumpy air, Sarah remained perfectly calm, continuing to write her note. Her military experience had put her through much worse situations than this. Meanwhile, James gripped his armrest tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Nervous, Flyer?" Sarah asked kindly, breaking their long silence. "I don't need your..." James started to snap but stopped himself when he saw other passengers looking at him disapprovingly. "I'm fine," he mumbled instead. Sarah nodded and returned to her writing. The note was almost complete now. She had carefully chosen every word, knowing they would have a profound impact on the man sitting next to her. As the turbulence continued, a flight attendant stumbled slightly near their row. Without hesitation, Sarah reached out and steadied her, showing the quick reflexes that had saved lives in combat zones. Several passengers noticed this and nodded in approval. "Thank you, Major," the flight attendant said gratefully. "Those are the same reflexes that saved lives last week, aren't they?" Sarah smiled modestly but didn't elaborate. She knew the time wasn't right yet. James, however, couldn't help but listen more closely now. The mention of saved lives had caught his attention, especially after seeing his son's name on that document. The note was finally finished. Sarah read it over one last time, making sure every word was perfect. She knew that what she was about to share would completely change James Morrison's world. The truth about his son, the evacuation mission, and her role in it was all there, waiting to be revealed. She folded the note carefully, her fingers pressing sharp creases into the paper. The time had come to show James Morrison exactly who he had been judging so harshly for the past few hours. Sarah held the folded note in her hands, taking a deep breath before making her next move. The plane had steadied now, and they were cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. It was the perfect moment to change James Morrison's life forever. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said quietly, turning to face him, "I have something you need to read." James barely looked at her, continuing to stare at his laptop screen. "I'm busy," he muttered, his fingers typing nothing important. "It's about your son, Daniel," Sarah said firmly. The typing stopped. James's fingers froze above the keyboard. His head turned slowly toward Sarah, his face a mix of confusion and sudden fear. "What did you say?" he whispered. "Your son, Daniel Morrison, 28 years old, sergeant in the United States Army." Sarah's voice was gentle but clear, "currently stationed overseas." The color drained from James's face. What do you know about my Danny?" Other passengers watched with interest as the scene unfolded. The Vietnam veteran leaned forward slightly in his seat, sensing something important was about to happen. Sarah held out the note. "Last week, I was leading a medical evacuation mission. We had to rescue several soldiers who were caught in a difficult situation. One of them was your son." James's hands shook as he reached for the note. The same hands that had tried to wave Sarah away from first class just hours ago now desperately grabbed for the paper she held. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes moving across the words Sarah had written. "Dear Mr. Morrison, you've spent this flight judging me by the color of my skin, but last week I spent 72 hours making sure your son Daniel survived a serious injury. He was hurt protecting his fellow soldiers during a rescue mission, showing the same courage that makes me proud to serve alongside him. While you were trying to have me removed from first class, I was reviewing the medical reports from his evacuation. Danny spoke about you during his recovery. He showed me pictures of his father, telling me how proud he was of you, how you taught him to stand up for what's right. He doesn't know about this flight. He doesn't know that his father refused to sit next to the person who helped save his life. The person who stayed by his side for 3 days straight, making sure he got the best care possible. Danny is going to be fine. He's recovering well and should be home in a few weeks. He's a hero, Mr. Morrison, and you would be ashamed to see how you've acted today. James's hands trembled so badly that the paper shook. Tears began to form in his eyes as he read the note a second time, then a third. The weight of his behavior crashed down on him all at once. Danny, my boy, he's hurt. James's voice cracked with emotion. But we just spoke last week. He said everything was fine. He didn't want you to worry, Sarah explained softly. He's strong, just like his father should be. He took a risk to save his friends, and he succeeded. You should be very proud. James looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. He saw not just her uniform or her skin color, but the strength and compassion in her eyes. The same strength that had kept his son alive. You saved my Danny? The words came out barely above a whisper. I did my duty, Mr. Morrison. Just like I'm doing my duty now, sitting here in first class, serving our country in uniform. Sarah's words carried no anger, no revenge, just simple truth. The other passengers sat in stunned silence. Maria, the flight attendant, wiped a tear from her eye as she watched the scene unfold. The businessman who had been recording earlier quietly put his phone away, realizing this moment was too personal to share. James Morrison, the man who had started this flight full of prejudice and pride, now sat with his head bowed, his son's story clutched in his shaking hands. The truth had finally broken through his wall of bias, and nothing would ever be the same. The next 30 minutes passed in complete silence as James Morrison struggled to process everything he had learned. His hand still held Sarah's note, now wrinkled from his tight grip. Tears had left small wet marks on the paper, but he couldn't bring himself to let it go. Can you? James finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Can you tell me more about what happened to Danny? Sarah turned to him with kind eyes. Of course, she said softly. She pulled out the medical reports she had been reviewing earlier. Your son was leading a team when they received a distress call from a village. Without hesitation, he took his unit to help. James listened intently, hanging on every word about his son. Other passengers had quieted their conversations, respectfully allowing this moment to unfold. The village was under attack, Sarah continued. Danny organized the evacuation of civilian families first. When one of his men got hit, he ran back into danger to drag him to safety. That's when she paused, knowing this part would be hard for a father to hear. Please, James urged, I need to know everything. That's when he was hit by falling debris. He could have retreated, but he stayed to make sure everyone got out safely. By the time we arrived for the medical evacuation, he had saved 14 lives. Sarah's voice filled with pride as she spoke about Danny's bravery. The Vietnam veteran across the aisle spoke up quietly. Sounds like a real hero, that boy of yours. James nodded, unable to speak. He remembered how Danny had always stood up for others, even as a child. Now his son was doing the same thing in uniform, risking his life to help strangers. When we got him to the medical facility, Sarah continued, he was more worried about his team than himself. Even with his injuries, he kept asking about the others. The first thing he said when he woke up was, did everyone make it? Maria approached with a box of tissues, offering them to James. His tears were flowing freely now, all his earlier prejudice replaced by a father's concern and pride. The whole time we were treating him, Sarah said, pulling out a photo from her briefcase, he kept talking about you. This is the picture he showed me. James looked at the photograph. It was from Danny's high school graduation day. Father and son stood together, both smiling proudly. James remembered that day clearly, how he had told Danny the world was his to conquer. He said you taught him to never back down when people needed help, Sarah said gently. He told me how you worked extra shifts to put him through college, how you supported his decision to join the military. James covered his face with his hands. I let him down today, he said through his fingers. Everything I taught him about courage and doing what's right. And look how I behaved. The young businessman who had been recording earlier leaned forward. It's never too late to change, sir. Sarah placed a hand on James's shoulder, the first contact between them since the flight began. Your son is going to be fine, Mr. Morrison. He's strong, just like his father can be. James looked at her hand, then at her face, seeing past his prejudices for the first time. Major Thompson, he said, his voice shaking, I don't deserve your kindness after how I treated you. This isn't about what anyone deserves, Sarah replied wisely. It's about who we choose to be, starting right now. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, but this time James didn't grab the armrest in fear. Instead, he carefully folded Sarah's note and placed it in his breast pocket, right next to his heart. Will you? He hesitated, then continued. Will you tell me more about Danny? About what he's doing over there? About the lives he's touched? Sarah smiled warmly, seeing the genuine change in the man beside her. I'd be honored to, she replied, beginning to share more stories about the son who had made his father proud, even if that father had temporarily lost his way. As the flight entered its 4th hour, the atmosphere in first class had completely changed. James Morrison, who had started the journey as an angry, prejudiced man, now sat turned towards Sarah, listening intently to every story about his son's service. Danny organized a reading program for the local children, Sarah was saying, showing James photos on her military-issue tablet. See these kids? They come to the base twice a week. Your son teaches them English during his free time. James leaned closer to look at the pictures, his eyes filling with pride. There was Danny, surrounded by smiling children, looking just like he did when he was a kid himself. He always loved helping others. James said softly, even in elementary school, you would stand up for kids being bullied. The little girl who had given Sarah the drawing earlier came back to their row, this time with her mother's permission to ask a question. Major Thompson, she said shyly, is it true that you save people's lives? Sarah smiled warmly at the child. I work with many brave soldiers who save lives, like Mr. Morrison's son. He's a true hero. James reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. Would you like to see my hero? He asked the little girl, showing her Danny's military portrait. His voice was gentle now, so different from his angry tone earlier. The girl looked at the picture with wide eyes. He looks just like you, she said innocently. James chuckled softly. He's much braver than me, he replied, glancing at Sarah with regret in his eyes. He knows how to treat people right. Maria, who had been watching the transformation all flight, approached with fresh coffee. Would either of you like a refill? She asked, no longer feeling the tension that had filled the cabin earlier. Yes, please, they both said at the same time, then shared a small smile at the coincidence. The Vietnam veteran spoke up again from across the aisle. Major, if you don't mind my asking, how many others were saved in that rescue mission? Sarah straightened in her seat, professional but proud. Thanks to soldiers like Danny, we evacuated 23 people that day. 3 military personnel and 20 civilians, including 7 children. James listened in amazement. The same woman he had tried to have removed from first class had not only saved his son, but had helped save so many others. Shame and gratitude fought for space in his heart. I've been so blind, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. All my life, I've been judging people without knowing their stories. A businessman from a few rows back called out, It's never too late to change, sir. We're all learning and growing. Sarah pulled out another document from her briefcase. Your son asked me to give you this when I saw you, she said, handing James an envelope. He wrote it while recovering, but I didn't know I'd be meeting you so soon. James's hands trembled as he opened the letter. Danny's familiar handwriting filled the page. Dear Dad, I know you're probably worried sick since you haven't heard from me in a few days. I'm okay, better than okay, actually. I've learned what true courage means out here. My commanding officer, Major Thompson, is teaching me that real strength isn't about power or position. It's about how we treat others. Remember when you used to tell me that a person's character is what matters most? Major Thompson proves that every day. She risks her life for others without hesitation, no matter who they are or where they come from. I hope you can meet her someday. I think she'd help you see the world differently, just like she's helped me. Love, Danny. James looked up from the letter, tears streaming down his face. The whole first-class cabin watched in respectful silence as this proud man finally understood the full weight of his prejudices and the beauty of letting them go. Major Thompson, he said, his voice cracking with emotion, would you tell me more about the children Danny teaches? I'd like to know everything about the good my son is doing in this world. As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, James Morrison was a changed man. He sat with his phone in his hands, showing Sarah photos of Danny growing up. Each picture told a story of the boy who would become a hero. This was his 10th birthday, James said, swiping to a photo of young Danny in a superhero costume. He insisted on inviting every single kid in his class, even the ones others left out. That was just who he was. Sarah smiled at the image. He hasn't changed, Mr. Morrison. Just last month, he organized a birthday party for a local child in the village near our base. Used his own money to buy presents for all the kids who came. The other passengers, who had witnessed James' remarkable transformation, were now openly participating in the conversation. The Vietnam veteran shared stories about his own service, while the businessman who had been recording earlier admitted he had learned an important lesson about prejudice. I need to do something, James said suddenly, sitting up straighter. I can't just learn this lesson and go back to my old ways. Major Thompson, how can I help support our troops, especially those working with local communities? Sarah thought for a moment. There are several organizations that help fund educational programs for children in areas where we serve, the same programs Danny works with. James pulled out his checkbook, something he usually used to show off his wealth. This time, his hands moved with purpose as he began writing. I want to donate to those programs, he said firmly. Not just money, but I want to be involved. Maybe I could help organize support for my company. The little girl who had been watching them spoke up again. Could I help too, Daddy? She asked her father in the row behind them. I could send my books to the children. Her father, who had been quiet throughout the flight, cleared his throat. I think we all could help, he said. Mr. Morrison isn't the only one who learned something today. Maria returned with landing preparation instructions, but she couldn't help adding her own thoughts. Sir, she said to James, I've been flying this route for 15 years. I've seen a lot of people in first class, but I've never seen someone change so completely in one flight. James looked down at his hands, remembering how they had angrily gestured for Sarah to be removed just hours ago. I was so wrong, he said quietly. But thanks to Major Thompson's kindness and my son's courage, I can try to be better. Sarah reached into her briefcase one last time. I have something else for you, she said, pulling out a small flash drive. These are videos from the reading program. Danny appears in many of them, teaching and playing with the kids. I was going to mail it to you, but now. James accepted the flash drive like it was made of gold. Thank you, he whispered. For everything. For saving my son, for teaching me this lesson, for being so kind when I was so. He couldn't finish the sentence. The plane descended through the clouds, the city of San Francisco appearing below them. The veteran across the aisle spoke up one last time. You know what they teach us in the military? The true test of a person isn't never making mistakes. It's what they do after they realize they were wrong. James nodded, understanding flowing through him. He looked at the donation check in his hand, then at Sarah. Major Thompson, would you help me set up a scholarship fund for military families and the communities they serve overseas? We could name it after Danny. Sarah's eyes brightened. He would love that, Mr. Morrison, and it would help so many people. As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, James Morrison realized that this flight had changed not just his views, but the entire direction of his life. The man who had boarded in Atlanta thinking he was better than others was landing in San Francisco with a mission to help make the world better for everyone. As the passengers prepared to leave the plane in San Francisco, the first-class cabin had become a place of unexpected friendship and change. James Morrison stood up slowly, gathering his belongings with hands that still trembled slightly from all the emotions he had experienced. Major Thompson, he said, turning to Sarah, I know a simple apology isn't enough, but I am truly sorry for my behavior earlier. Would you let me buy you dinner? I'd like to learn more about the scholarship program we discussed. Sarah smiled warmly. That would be fine, Mr. Morrison. Danny would be proud to see you taking these steps. The other passengers began to stand, but nobody rushed to leave like usual. Instead, they watched as James reached up to get Sarah's military backpack from the overhead bin. The same bag he had earlier pretended not to notice when she was struggling to store it. You know, the Vietnam veteran said, approaching them, I've served with heroes of every color and background. What matters isn't what a person looks like, It's what they do when others need help. The little girl who had drawn the picture for Sarah came forward one last time. Major Thompson, will you tell Danny's students that they have friends in San Francisco now? She held out another drawing she had made during the flight, this one showing people of different colors holding hands. Sarah knelt down to accept the drawing. I'll make sure they know. And maybe someday, when Mr. Morrison visits the program, he can deliver some drawings himself. James's eyes lit up at the suggestion. I'd like that, he said softly. I'd like that very much. As they walked through the jet bridge together, Maria and John, the flight attendants, stopped them. Mr. Morrison, Maria said, I've seen a lot of angry passengers in my career, but I've never seen someone change so completely. Thank you for showing us that people can learn and grow. James reached into his pocket and pulled out Sarah's note, the one that had changed everything. Would you like to know what real courage looks like? He asked Maria, his voice full of emotion. It looks like someone who responds to hatred with kindness, who saves the life of a stranger's son without hesitation, who teaches instead of condemns. The businessman who had recorded the earlier confrontation approached with his phone. Sir, I deleted the video I took before, but if you're willing, I'd like to take a new one of you and Major Thompson shaking hands. People need to see that change is possible. James looked at Sarah questioningly. She nodded her approval, and they shook hands as the businessman recorded the moment. The veteran saluted them both, and other passengers applauded. I'll call Danny tonight, James said as they walked into the terminal. I want him to know about this flight, about how I learned what he already knows. That character is what matters, not color. Sarah handed him a business card. Here's my contact information for the scholarship program, and James, she said, using his first name for the first time, remember that change isn't just about one moment. It's about what we do every day after. James took the card carefully. I understand now, and I promise you, and Danny, that I'll do better. Every day. As they prepared to go their separate ways, the little girl's father approached with one last comment. My daughter asked me something important, he said. She wanted to know if angels wear military uniforms. I told her that sometimes they do, because they teach us to be better people. James watched as Sarah walked away, her uniform crisp and proud, her head held high. He touched the note in his pocket one more time, knowing it would remain there, close to his heart, as a reminder of the day he learned to see people for who they truly were. And somewhere overseas, Danny Morrison was teaching children to read, not knowing that his courage and kindness had helped his father learn the most important lesson of all, that love and respect know no colors, and that it's never too late to change.